It began as a hushed conversation behind palace walls, one that aides tried to bury and courtiers refused to acknowledge. But the look on Catherine's face as she emerged said everything. Pale, shaken, and uncharacteristically exposed, she carried the weight of something far more serious than routine royal matters. And within hours, whispers turned into panic. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, it was framed as nothing more than a routine consultation, another quiet legal review tucked deep within the machinery of royal administration. But those familiar with the palace's inner workings quickly sensed something different. This meeting had not followed protocol. There had been no gradual scheduling, no layered approvals, no carefully timed coordination with public duties. Instead, Catherine and William were summoned with a level of urgency rarely seen, ushered through corridors that had long been associated with discretion rather than crisis. And waiting for them was not a ceremonial advisor or a routine briefing officer, but a senior legal figure, one whose presence alone signaled that something deeply sensitive had surfaced. Reports suggest the discovery came during a routine archival audit, one of those quiet, methodical processes designed to preserve the monarchy's vast legal and historical framework. But this time, the audit did not simply catalog the past. It uncovered it. A set of documents old, sealed, and deliberately obscured had been brought to light. And the moment their contents were understood, the atmosphere shifted. Palace aides, usually composed and methodical, were instructed to halt discussions entirely. Conversations were cut short, files were restricted. What insiders later described as an internal lockdown was quietly enforced, not through public orders, but through silence itself. Catherine's reaction, however, could not be contained. Those who saw her leave that room spoke of a rare loss of composure, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. Her expression carried a quiet shock, the kind that comes not from surprise alone, but from realization. William, ever controlled, moved quickly to shield both her and the situation. His posture shifted, his focus sharpened, and those around him noted a subtle but firm change in tone. This was no longer a matter to be observed, it was something to be managed, contained, and understood before it spread further. What made it more unsettling was the timing. For weeks there had been a sense subtle, almost imperceptible, that something beneath the surface was stirring. Media insiders had hinted at unusual patterns. Royal correspondents had noted brief disruptions in routine, slight delays, moments where the carefully maintained rhythm of palace life seemed to falter. At the time, it was dismissed as coincidence. But now, those fragments began to align, forming a picture that was far more troubling than anyone had anticipated. And then came the whispers. Not loud, not confirmed, but persistent. Insiders suggest this was never meant to surface, never meant to be revisited, let alone understood by a new generation of royals. The documents, whatever they contained, were not just historical records. They were something more deliberate, more intentional, something designed to remain buried within the structure of the monarchy itself. And yet, here they were, sitting at the center of a growing storm, forcing questions that had long been avoided. Because in a system built on tradition, continuity, and carefully guarded legacy, the sudden reappearance of something hidden carries a weight far beyond its pages. It challenges not just the present, but the past and everything that connects the two. Catherine understood that. William understood it even more. And as the silence deepened and the palace tightened its grip on information, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no ordinary discovery. But the real shock wasn't the discovery itself. It was what those forgotten documents revealed about a long-buried royal arrangement. Hidden deep within a restricted archive, sealed under decades of silence, sat a file no one was meant to revisit, until a palace lawyer did. And what they found inside wasn't just paperwork, it was a blueprint for a legacy quietly rewritten. The discovery did not arrive with drama or ceremony. It emerged quietly, almost accidentally. During what was meant to be a routine audit, one of countless internal reviews, designed to maintain order within the vast and intricate structure of royal estates. These audits rarely attract attention. They are methodical, precise, and often uneventful. But this time, something didn't align. A discrepancy, small at first, buried within a chain of estate documents, triggered a closer look, and that closer look led deeper, past standard records and into a layer of documentation rarely accessed, even by those entrusted with safeguarding the monarchy's legal foundations. What the lawyer uncovered was not a single file, but a carefully preserved collection of documents bound together not by coincidence, but by intent. Reports suggest these records trace back to private directives issued during the later years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Directives that were never publicly acknowledged, never referenced in official summaries, and never meant to be part of the broader institutional narrative. They existed outside the visible structure, quietly shaping decisions without ever revealing their influence. And now, for the first time, they were being read again. At the center of these documents were references subtle, coded, but unmistakable to agreements tied to inheritance and succession contingencies. Not the kind outlined in public charters or ceremonial declarations, but something far more controlled. These were contingency frameworks, designed to activate under specific conditions, outlining how certain assets, titles, or trusts could be redirected, reassigned, or even withheld. The language was precise, almost surgical, leaving little room for interpretation once understood. And yet, for decades, it had remained untouched, its implications dormant beneath layers of protocol and tradition. What made the situation even more unsettling were the mentions of properties and holdings that did not appear in standard disclosures. Names surfaced estates, trusts, and titles that, while connected to the monarchy, had never been openly discussed in this context. Some appeared to exist within a separate legal structure, shielded from the usual channels of oversight. Others hinted at arrangements that blurred the line between personal inheritance and institutional control. And as each reference was examined, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested these documents were not isolated decisions, but part of a broader design. Then came the inconsistencies. Subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once identified. Certain provisions within the documents did not align with known actions taken in later years. Decisions that had been publicly framed one way now appeared to have been influenced by unseen conditions. It raised a question that no one within the palace was prepared to answer openly. Had some of the monarchy's most significant choices been guided by agreements that were never meant to be known? The response was immediate. The moment the implications became clear, the file was escalated beyond routine review. Senior legal advisors were brought in not gradually, but all at once. Access was restricted, discussions were contained, and those who were briefed understood the gravity of what they were seeing. This was no longer a matter of historical curiosity. It was a live issue, one that carried potential consequences for the present structure of the monarchy. Because if these documents held legal weight and early interpretations suggested they didn't just reflect the past. They had the power to shape what came next. And that realization shifted everything. The quiet audit had become a catalyst, the forgotten file a trigger, and the carefully maintained stability of the institution now rested on how this discovery would be handled. And as the contents began to circulate among the inner circle, one truth became impossible to ignore. Someone had tried to keep this buried. For decades, the monarchy has operated on an unspoken understanding some decisions are made quietly, never to be questioned. But this discovery shattered that silence, exposing a hidden layer of royal legacy that could rewrite everything. At the heart of this revelation lies a concept rarely discussed outside the palace's most guarded circles, the idea of the sacred trust. It is not simply about wealth, property, or titles. It is about stewardship. The monarchy has long framed its assets not as personal possessions, but as responsibilities held on behalf of something larger: history, continuity, the nation itself. Every estate, every title, every carefully preserved holding is part of that invisible structure, passed down not through choice, but through obligation. And for generations, that structure has relied on one critical element: silence. Because silence allows flexibility. It allows decisions to be made behind closed doors, shaped by circumstance rather than public expectation. And historically, there have been quiet, deliberate moments when confidential arrangements were put in place to protect that system. Reports suggest that even in earlier reigns, contingency frameworks existed, designed to respond to unforeseen challenges. These were not betrayals of tradition, but extensions of it, tools used to preserve stability when the visible structure alone was not enough. But those arrangements were always meant to remain hidden, their influence felt but never seen. What makes this discovery so unsettling is the suggestion that those hidden mechanisms may have been far more active and far more recent than anyone realized. The documents uncovered do not simply reflect a distant past. They hint at decisions that may still carry weight today, quietly shaping the distribution of influence, access, and inheritance within the royal family. And if that is true, then the expectations surrounding who inherits what and why are no longer as fixed as they once seemed. This is where the tension begins to build. Because the monarchy thrives on clarity, on the appearance of order and predictability. The line of succession is meant to be understood. The distribution of roles is meant to feel inevitable, but these documents introduce uncertainty into that equation. They suggest that beneath the visible structure lies another layer, one that can alter outcomes without warning, one that can redirect the future in ways that are never publicly explained. For younger members of the royal family, the implications are particularly profound. Figures like Charlotte, still growing into their roles, have always been seen as part of a clearly defined future. But now, that future feels less certain. Not unstable, not chaotic, but conditional. Dependent on factors that may not yet be fully understood, even by those closest to the center of power. And that realization carries a quiet weight, one that cannot easily be dismissed or ignored. Insiders have begun to describe the situation in stark terms. Words like structurally destabilizing have surfaced not because the monarchy is on the brink of collapse, but because the discovery challenges the very framework through which stability has been maintained. It forces a reconsideration of how decisions are made, how authority is exercised, and how much of the past remains hidden beneath the surface of the present. And yet, despite the growing tension, there is no immediate resolution, no clear path forward, only a deeper understanding that what has been uncovered cannot simply be filed away again. It demands attention. It demands interpretation. And most of all, it demands a response that balances tradition with truth, without allowing either to unravel the other. But if the document itself was explosive, the implications for certain royal figures were even more unsettling. It wasn't just what the document said it was, who it involved. And once those names surfaced, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted instantly from concern to crisis. At first, the references appeared indirect coded mentions, layered phrasing, names embedded within clauses that required careful interpretation. But as legal advisors began to connect those fragments, the picture became clearer and far more unsettling. These were not distant figures or historical placeholders. These were central members of the modern royal structure, individuals whose roles, influence, and futures were thought to be clearly defined. And yet here they were, appearing within a framework that suggested alternative arrangements had been quietly considered, perhaps even prepared, long before anyone realized. The implications were immediate. Because if those documents carried legal standing, even in part, they introduced the possibility of shifts subtle, but significant in how influence and control could be exercised. Not dramatic overthrows, not visible changes in hierarchy, but adjustments beneath the surface. Adjustments that could redefine access to certain assets, reshape responsibilities, or alter the balance of power in ways that would never be publicly explained. And in an institution built on continuity, even the suggestion of that kind of change was enough to trigger unease. Then came the harder questions, not spoken openly, but present in every private conversation that followed. Were some individuals aware of these arrangements? Had they been prepared, quietly, for outcomes that others knew nothing about? Or more unsettling still, had certain members of the royal family been deliberately excluded from decisions that directly affected their future? The documents did not offer clear answers. They hinted, they suggested, they implied, but they did not confirm. And that ambiguity only deepened the tension. William's response, according to those familiar with the situation, was immediate but measured. There was no outward display of alarm, no visible reaction that could be interpreted beyond the room. But internally, his focus sharpened. Every detail mattered. Every clause, every reference, every inconsistency was examined with precision. This was not just about understanding what had been written, it was about understanding what it meant for the structure he was expected to inherit and protect. And in that moment, the weight of that responsibility became impossible to ignore. For Catherine, the impact was more personal, more immediate. Because beyond the legal complexity and institutional implications, there was a simpler, more pressing concern for her children. The future she had believed to be stable, carefully mapped, now carried an element of uncertainty. Not instability, but unpredictability. And for someone who had built her role around balance, protection, and continuity, that shift was deeply unsettling. It wasn't just about what the document said, it was about what they might allow, what they might change, and what they might take away without warning. As these realizations settled in, the atmosphere within the palace began to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Conversations became more guarded. Alignments, once assumed, began to feel less certain. Not openly, not dramatically, but quietly, almost instinctively, factions started to form. Some leaned toward preserving the existing structure at all costs. Others focused on understanding and potentially adapting to what had been uncovered. And in between them stood a growing tension, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Because this was no longer just a legal matter. It had become something deeper, a question of trust, of knowledge, of who held the true understanding of the monarchy's inner workings. And as that question lingered, unresolved and increasingly urgent, the need for decisive action began to take shape. Not publicly, not yet, but within the walls where decisions are made, the pressure was building. And as tension mounted behind closed doors, one figure stepped forward to take control of the situation. Within hours of the discovery, senior royals were summoned not for ceremony, but for crisis management. The meeting was swift, closed, and unlike anything seen in recent years. There was no time for the slow choreography that usually defines royal coordination. No carefully spaced consultations, no gradual alignment of advisors. This was immediate, urgent, a convergence of authority brought together under pressure that could not be delayed. Reports suggest the gathering included not only senior members of the royal family, but also a select circle of legal minds, individuals who operate quietly behind the institution, rarely visible, but essential when the structure itself is at stake. And the message was clear from the beginning. This was not a discussion about history. This was about consequences. At the center of it all stood King Charles, reportedly briefed under what insiders describe as restricted disclosure conditions. That phrase alone carried weight. It implied that even within the highest level of the monarchy, information was being carefully managed, filtered, controlled, and delivered with precision. Not everything was laid bare at once. Instead, the situation was presented in layers, each detail revealing just enough to convey urgency without immediately triggering irreversible decisions. Because what was at stake required more than reaction, it demanded control. But control was not easy to establish. As the documents were reviewed, differing interpretations began to emerge. Some legal advisors suggested that the directives, while significant, might not carry enforceable authority in the present structure. Others warned the opposite, that even partial validity could create ripple effects, forcing reconsideration of decisions that had long been treated as settled. And between those interpretations lay a growing tension, one that could not be resolved quickly or comfortably. This is where the conversation shifted from understanding to strategy. Because once the potential impact was acknowledged, the focus turned to what should be done next. Containment became the first priority. Not secrecy for its own sake, but controlled handling. The idea was simple in theory. Keep the discovery within a tight circle, limit exposure, and prevent speculation from spiraling beyond control. But even that approach carried risks. Because in an institution built on public trust, silence can be as dangerous as revelation. And some within the room understood that. They raised the question of transparency, not full disclosure, but a measured acknowledgement that could prevent rumors from filling the void. The debate intensified. Containment versus controlled transparency. Protection versus preemption. Each option carried consequences, and none offered a perfect solution. And as those arguments unfolded, the pressure inside the room only increased. Because time was no longer on their side. The longer the discovery remained unaddressed, the greater the chance that it would surface in ways no one could control. Outside that room, subtle changes were already taking place. Security measures tightened not visibly, but effectively. Access to certain records was restricted further. Communication channels were narrowed. Even within the palace, information began to move differently, slower, more carefully, as if every word carried potential weight. It was not panic, it was precision. But beneath that precision was an unmistakable sense of urgency. Insiders would later describe this moment as a defining point for the institution. Not because a decision had been made, but because the stakes had been fully realized. For the first time, everyone involved understood that this was not just about a document or a discovery. It was about the integrity of the system itself and how it would withstand a challenge from within. And yet, even as strategies were debated and positions quietly formed, one question refused to settle. It lingered, unspoken but present in every calculation, every pause, every measured response. Because no matter how carefully the situation was handled internally, there was always the possibility that it would not stay contained. But even as decisions were debated, the deeper question remained: what happens if this truth reaches beyond palace walls? The palace didn't erupt, it froze. Conversations became measured, appearances carefully controlled, and every movement carried a new weight. Something had shifted and everyone felt it. At first, the changes were almost imperceptible. A pause that lingered a moment too long during conversations. A glance exchanged and quickly withdrawn. A silence where there would normally be reassurance. Those who moved within the palace's inner circle began to sense it immediately, an unspoken awareness that something significant had been uncovered, something that could not yet be addressed openly. And so, instead of confrontation, there was restraint. Instead of reaction, there was control. But beneath that control, tension quietly built. Senior royals, long accustomed to operating with clarity and certainty, began to adjust their behavior in subtle ways. Their words became more deliberate, their interactions more cautious. It wasn't fear, not in the traditional sense, but it was awareness. Awareness that the foundation beneath them might not be as fixed as it once seemed. And that awareness changed everything. Even routine discussions carried an edge, a careful consideration of what could be said, what should be withheld, and what might unknowingly reveal more than intended. Publicly, however, the rhythm continued. Appearances were maintained. Engagements were fulfilled. The structure held, as it always does. But there was a difference, one that those watching closely could not ignore. A strain, subtle but present, woven into the tone of each interaction. It wasn't visible in any obvious way, but it was felt. A shift in energy. A quiet heaviness that suggested something deeper was unfolding behind the scenes. And for an institution built on composure, even the slightest deviation carries meaning. Inside, the more difficult questions began to take shape. Not spoken openly, but impossible to avoid. Who knew about these documents before they surfaced? How far back did that knowledge go? And perhaps most unsettling of all, who had been left unaware? These were not accusations. They were uncertainties. But in a system that relies on trust, even uncertainty can create fractures. Small at first, almost invisible, but growing with each unanswered question. As those fractures formed, another shift became necessary: protection. The younger members of the royal family, particularly those still growing into their roles, were gradually distanced from the unfolding situation. Not out of secrecy alone, but out of caution. There was a recognition that what had been uncovered carried implications that extended beyond the present moment. And until those implications were fully understood, it was safer to shield those not yet equipped to navigate them. But that decision, while protective, also reinforced the sense that something serious was being kept just beneath the surface. Beyond the palace walls, the silence began to attract attention. Royal correspondents, accustomed to reading between the lines, started to notice the subtle shifts, patterns that didn't quite align, moments that felt slightly out of place. And while no official statement was made, speculation began to grow. Quiet at first, then gradually louder, as more observers sensed that something was unfolding, something significant enough to alter the usual rhythm of royal life. Insiders would later describe this period in stark terms. Not as a moment of crisis, but as something more controlled, more deliberate. The calm before a much larger storm. A pause, not of resolution, but of anticipation. Because within that stillness, everyone understood that the situation had not been resolved, it had only begun to reveal itself. And as that realization settled in, the sense of unease deepened, spreading quietly through every level of the institution. Because beyond the palace gates, the world was already beginning to sense that something wasn't right. Rumors have a way of finding their way out, and this one was no exception. What began as whispers among insiders soon caught the attention of those watching closely from the outside. At first, it was nothing more than a shift in tone. A carefully worded remark from a royal correspondent. A subtle hesitation in the language used by those who usually spoke with certainty. But for those who follow the monarchy closely, those who understand its rhythms, its patterns, its unspoken signals, these small changes were enough to raise questions. And once those questions began to circulate, they were impossible to contain. Media insiders started to hint at something larger, something undefined but undeniably significant. Phrases like a major undisclosed development began to surface, not in headlines, but in conversations just beneath them. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't exposure. But it was enough to suggest that something was unfolding behind palace walls, something that had yet to be acknowledged, but could not remain hidden indefinitely. Royal correspondents, often cautious in their approach, began to note unusual behavior within the palace itself. Engagements continued, statements were issued, the public-facing structure remained intact. And yet, beneath that structure, there were signs small but consistent that something was different. Timing felt off, messaging felt restrained. Even the most routine updates carried a sense of careful control, as if every word had been measured against something unseen. But the real concern wasn't what had already surfaced, it was what might come next. Because the discovery, as contained as it had been internally, had passed through multiple hands. Legal advisors, administrative staff, archival personnel, each step in the process carried a risk. Not intentional exposure, not deliberate leaks, but the simple reality that information, once uncovered, rarely remains confined. And within that reality lay the growing fear that the situation could escape the palace's control at any moment. That fear began to shape strategy. Pressure mounted quietly but steadily, forcing those at the center of the situation to consider their options. Continue the silence, maintain control, and hope the story fades before it fully forms. Or take a different approach, acknowledge just enough to guide the narrative, to prevent speculation from turning into something more damaging. Neither path was without risk. Silence could be interpreted as concealment. Disclosure could trigger questions with no easy answers. And between those two choices, the margin for error was shrinking. Meanwhile, public curiosity continued to grow. Not dramatically, not explosively, but steadily. A sense that something was being withheld began to take hold, fueled not by evidence, but by absence. And in an age where absence often speaks louder than presence, that alone was enough to sustain attention. The longer the palace remained silent, the more space there was for interpretation. And interpretation, once it begins, rarely follows a controlled path. The stakes, already high, began to rise further. Because this was no longer just an internal matter. It was becoming a narrative, one that could take shape beyond the palace's influence, shaped by those with only fragments of the truth. And once that happens, control becomes far more difficult to regain. And now, the monarchy faces a decision it cannot delay, whether to confront the truth or let it unravel on its own. At its core, this isn't just about a document, it's about the future of the crown itself. Because when the past resurfaces, it demands to be reckoned with. For generations, the monarchy has balanced on a delicate line between what is known and what is carefully withheld. Tradition has always been its anchor, a steady force that gives the institution its shape, its authority, its sense of permanence. But tradition alone has never told the full story. Beneath it lies a quieter reality, decisions made in private, strategies formed behind closed doors, arrangements designed to protect continuity at all costs. And now, with this discovery, that hidden layer has begun to press against the surface, forcing a confrontation that cannot easily be avoided. The struggle is no longer abstract. It is immediate. On one side stands the need for transparency, the growing expectation that even the most enduring institutions must adapt to a world that demands clarity. On the other stands the weight of tradition, the understanding that not every decision can be exposed without risking the very stability it was meant to preserve. And between those two forces lies the monarchy itself, caught in a moment that will define how it moves forward, not just in the present, but for generations to come. The implications stretch far beyond a single discovery. They reach into the core of succession, into the quiet agreements that shape who leads, who follows, and how that transition unfolds. They touch on legacy, not just the legacy that is presented to the public, but the one that exists behind it, built through decisions that were never meant to be questioned. And most importantly, they challenge the trust that holds everything together. Because trust, once shaken, cannot simply be restored through silence. It must be rebuilt, carefully, deliberately, and with an awareness of what has been revealed. In the midst of this uncertainty, certain figures have begun to take on a new significance. Catherine and William, long seen as the steady center of the monarchy's future, now stand in a position that carries even greater weight, not because they had sought it, but because the moment demands it. Their role is no longer just to represent continuity, it is to embody it, to provide a sense of stability at a time when the foundations themselves feel less certain. And that responsibility, quiet as it may appear, is immense, because the institution cannot afford to fracture. It cannot allow uncertainty to turn into instability. Every decision now is measured against a single overriding priority: continuity. The preservation of the crown as a symbol, as a structure, as something that endures beyond individual moments of crisis. And yet, preservation does not mean denial. It does not mean ignoring what has been uncovered. Instead, it requires a careful balance, acknowledging enough to move forward, while protecting enough to ensure that the system remains intact. This is where the deeper meaning begins to emerge. This is no longer just a story about hidden documents or undisclosed arrangements. It is a story about choice, about how an institution rooted in history chooses to respond when that history becomes impossible to ignore. Does it retreat into silence, relying on tradition to carry it through, or does it adapt, reshaping itself just enough to accommodate the truth without losing its identity? The answer is not immediate. It will unfold slowly, through decisions that may never be fully explained, through actions that will be interpreted long after they are taken. But one thing is already clear: something has changed. Not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. A shift has occurred, quiet but undeniable, altering the way the crown understands itself and the way it must move forward. Because in the end, the monarchy survives not by hiding its past, but by deciding which parts of it define the future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.